The call came in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, while I was switching between tasks that required no emotion. Her voice sounded light, almost careless, as if she were announcing a delayed delivery instead of a decision. Then she said it calmly. They had moved to another state and simply forgot to mention it. No discussion followed. No pause. I stayed quiet, not because I was shocked, but because experience teaches restraint. Silence allows truth to surface without interference, especially when someone expects outrage and receives attention instead. It revealed more than anger ever could at that exact moment. I let the call in naturally, resisting the urge to question her timeline or tone. There was intention hidden beneath her casual phrasing, and I could hear it clearly. Moving states is not impulsive. It involves planning, documents, coordination, and decisions that mature adults cannot overlook. My calm unsettled her more than confrontation would have. I imagined boxes sealed, addresses changed, routines already rewritten without consultation. That realization settled heavily. What she described as an afterthought was actually a finished operation, executed confidently, assuming distance would replace accountability. That assumption was the quiet mistake everything else would grow from later. I did not pace the room or replay the call obsessively. Instead, I sat still and considered logistics, obligations, and implications. Children, work records, legal boundaries, all require notice and agreement. Forgetting is not a defense when responsibility exists. I realized she believed the distance itself was the message. That physical separation would soften consequences and close doors quietly. She underestimated how clarity sharpens when emotion is removed. I was no longer reacting as a husband. I was observing as a man who understood systems, patterns, and predictable outcomes. Experience teaches patience before action, not panic disguised as urgency alone. By the time the silence settled, something had shifted permanently. I was not confused. I was alert. Her casual tone failed to conceal preparation, and preparation leaves evidence. This was no emotional impulse. It was a calculated move delivered with a smile. She believed the conversation ended when the call disconnected. In reality, it had just opened, not with shouting or threats, but with attention, memory, and precision. The kind that does not rush forward loudly, but moves deliberately until the truth has nowhere left to hide. It was the beginning of consequences unfolding at a controlled, irreversible pace ahead. That evening I opened files I had not touched in years, not with anger, but with method. Shared obligations do not vanish when someone crosses a border. I reviewed custody clauses, employment records, insurance policies, and registration requirements that move slower than emotion. Each document told the same story. Decisions had been made without closure. She believed distance erased responsibility, yet responsibility travels well. I was not hunting mistakes. I was mapping facts. In adulthood, clarity is power. The more I read, the clearer it became that her confidence rested on assumption, not confirmation, and assumptions collapse when examined patiently. I continued through timelines and correspondence, noting dates that refused to align. Moves require consent, notice, and transition plans, especially when others are affected. None of those steps were invisible. She packed belongings and loaded trucks, but systems remembered everything she overlooked. Schools track enrollment. Employers track addresses. Courts track compliance. Adults know this, which is why her casual tone surprised me. She had mistaken speed for completion. I felt no urge to intervene immediately. This stage required understanding the scope, not announcing awareness, because premature noise only warns people to hide better. Later consequences always favor those who wait. As I cross-referenced details, something else became obvious. This was not an emotional escape or a reckless gamble. It was a calculated relocation delivered with charm, assuming politeness would disarm scrutiny. That realization changed my posture completely. I stopped thinking like a spouse and started thinking like a witness. Leverage is rarely dramatic. It is quiet, patient, and rooted in records. Every unchecked box, every unsigned notice, strengthened my position without effort. I was not collecting weapons. I was standing still while the ground beneath her certainty began to shift. Time favors preparation more than emotion alone every time. By midnight, the picture was complete enough to let me sleep calmly. Nothing needed to be chased. Nothing needed to be announced. She believed she carried freedom with her, but what she truly took was exposure. Responsibility follows choices, even across borders, especially when ignored. This was never about stopping her future or punishing her decision. It was about recognizing that leverage often survives relocation. While she unpacked boxes and arranged furniture, I organized understanding. The advantage was not anger or speed. It was patience paired with certainty, and that combination never expires. Experience teaches restraint before irreversible action begins. I opened a blank message and stared at it longer than expected. Words came quickly, but wisdom slowed my hands. Experience taught me that messages written too soon reveal more about the sender than the situation. I typed an opening, erased it, tried another, erased that too. Courage was never missing. Precision was what I waited for. This was not a note to release feelings. It was a document meant to land and remain. Long after the screen went dark, I left the draft untouched for 2 full days. Silence works like pressure, revealing who needs noise to survive. During that pause, I replayed the call without emotion and examined its gaps. She expected reaction, not restraint. Each hour without response unsettled her certainty and strengthened mine. I was not delaying action. I was allowing clarity to mature. Rushed messages invite defense. Patient ones invite exposure. Time favors those who let consequences arrive on schedule without announcing themselves first publicly. On the 3rd day, I returned to the message with steadier hands. I wrote slowly, checking every line against facts rather than feelings. Dates replaced opinions. Procedures replaced accusations. I asked questions that required answers instead of arguments. There was no blame, no explanation, no emotional framing. Just clarity arranged carefully. This kind of writing does not shout. It waits. People who rely on confusion feel exposed when faced with order. It removes shelter without raising a single voice calmly. When I finally sent it, nothing dramatic followed immediately. That was the point. The email was not meant to provoke. It was meant to exist. Calm words sit heavily with those who depend on chaos. They reread, hesitate, and reveal themselves through response. I did not feel relief after sending it. I felt alignment. Timing had done its work. The message was no longer mine. It belonged to truth. And once released, it could not be softened again by anyone. That restraint was intentional. Adults learn that power is rarely immediate. It unfolds when patience meets structure. I closed my laptop and slept well that night, not because the issue was resolved, but because it was positioned correctly. The silence after the email mattered more than the message itself. In that quiet space, reactions would form, mistakes would surface, and the next move would no longer require urgency, only accuracy. Calm preparation always outlives impulsive confidence in the end results. Her reply arrived before I had finished my coffee, which told me more than its content ever could. Speed reveals anxiety. She wrote as if she were already on trial, explaining choices I had not challenged and defending actions I had not questioned. There was urgency, but no strategy. Emotion leaked through every sentence, wrapped in confidence that felt rehearsed yet fragile. That was the moment I understood she had not slowed down to think. She had reacted, not prepared, and reaction always exposes more than silence. I read the message twice, then a 3rd time, not searching for apology but for structure. There was none. No reference to counsel, no mention of process, no awareness of consequence. She spoke as if physical distance created a legal vacuum, as if crossing a border erased agreements signed years earlier. Adults learn differently, sometimes painfully. Systems remember. Jurisdiction follows responsibility. Her reply ignored that reality entirely, which meant she believed certainty came from movement alone. What stood out most was what she did not ask. She did not request clarification or seek understanding. She assumed authority and explained herself downward, as though explanation equaled closure. That assumption confirmed everything. People who consult advisors pause before speaking. People who move alone speak quickly and hope speed substitutes protection. Her words were not careless. They were confident in the wrong direction, and misplaced confidence always signals vulnerability to those paying attention. I did not respond immediately. There was no need. Her message had already shifted the balance. Without pressure, without confrontation, she revealed her position completely. I realized then that the situation no longer required persuasion. It required patience. Her certainty had cracked under its own weight, not because I pushed, but because I waited. Silence after revelation is not absence. It is space where consequences begin organizing themselves quietly. By the time I closed the email, I felt no satisfaction, only clarity. She believed the reply would steady her ground. Instead, it outlined its limits. Experience teaches that you do not interrupt someone when they are explaining their mistake. You let them finish. Her confidence did not collapse loudly. It softened, then thinned, then gave way to something unmistakable: awareness. And once awareness appears, momentum changes direction permanently. From that point forward, every step belonged to process, not emotion, and process never forgets anything. When third parties entered the situation, the atmosphere shifted immediately. What had sounded confident days earlier became cautious and fragmented. Messages included additional names. Responses slowed. Tone softened. The relocation was no longer presented as decisive, but as misunderstood. I recognized the pattern well. Confidence survives only in isolation. Once professionals review facts, assumptions lose protection. I said nothing and watched adjustments appear without my involvement. Silence created room where reality could speak louder than any argument ever could alone. Emails began arriving with careful phrasing, as though rewritten by invisible hands. Explanations expanded, then contradicted earlier statements without acknowledgement. Calls were returned hours later, no longer immediate. I noticed the shift from certainty to consultation. Someone had finally asked questions she could not answer quickly. That change mattered. I resisted the temptation to clarify or correct. Adults know intervention too early interrupts accountability before it fully forms. Patience protects outcomes better than urgency ever will when stakes rise quietly. I did not celebrate the change. I observed it. Professionals introduce structure, and structure exposes shortcuts. Calendars were requested. Records were reviewed. Questions appeared that required documentation rather than emotion. Each inquiry narrowed the space where stories could bend. I remained consistent and available without leading. By stepping back, I allowed responsibility to return to its rightful owner. Weight transfers naturally when no one volunteers to carry it anymore. That moment marked the escalation everyone quietly anticipated without direct confrontation. The more voices joined the exchange, the less certain her position sounded. Statements softened into possibilities. Certainty became conditional. I could sense concern replacing confidence, not because of my actions, but because of oversight. Silence forced her to confront unanswered questions alone. Third parties do not accept narratives without verification. They demand alignment. This was no longer personal. It had become procedural, and procedure does not negotiate with feelings or intentions. That realization shifted momentum beyond anything emotional arguments achieve. I understood then that escalation does not require confrontation. It requires absence. By removing myself from emotional labor, I allowed consequences to surface naturally. She felt the pressure I no longer absorbed. Responsibility reclaimed its weight. Silence did not protect her. It revealed her. When third parties enter, outcomes stop bending. They settle. I stayed still while accountability completed its journey, arriving precisely where it was always meant to land. That was the turning point no threats could produce alone. She asked to talk one evening after days of careful distance. Not to argue, not to justify, but to understand what came next. That request alone signaled change. People seek explanation only when certainty has failed. I agreed without urgency and without conditions. There was no satisfaction in it. Power had already shifted quietly, and this conversation was not a negotiation. It was an acknowledgement that control no longer lived where she believed it had once before the call arrived. When we spoke, I did not revisit old wounds or raise my voice. I laid out options slowly, explaining consequences without threat or emotion. Paths forward were clear and limited, shaped by process rather than preference. Adults recognize fairness when they see it. She listened more than she spoke, measuring each pause. The absence of anger unsettled her more than any accusation could have, because it removed the familiar terrain of conflict entirely and left nothing for drama to feed. I noticed the moment realization surfaced behind her questions. She was no longer trying to regain control, only to understand where it now rested. I answered honestly without over-explaining. Control does not require persuasion once it is established. My calm was not strategy in that moment. It was alignment. I had stopped defending positions that were already protected and that shift changed the temperature of everything between us. It also signaled permanence she could finally sense without explanation or appeal. There were no demands placed on the table. I did not ask for apologies or concessions. I clarified what would happen under each option and where responsibility would land. Choice became real because consequences were no longer theoretical. That reality sobers people quickly. She understood she was not being cornered. She was being released from illusion, which is far more destabilizing than pressure or force. That moment ended the struggle without conflict or ceremony and reset every boundary permanently afterward. When the conversation ended, nothing dramatic followed. That was the point. Control had already arrived, quietly and completely. It did not need validation or celebration. I felt no triumph, only relief rooted in clarity. I was no longer responding to her decisions. I was moving within my own. Power, I learned again, does not announce itself. It shows up settled, patient, and irreversible. By then, the outcome was already beyond debate, and every next step confirmed it silently from then. I watched the consequences settle after the move became permanent. Boxes stayed unpacked in another state, but assumptions did not survive the transition. Agreements were revisited carefully, not emotionally, and rewritten where silence had created gaps. Boundaries that once blurred under familiarity were redrawn with precision. Responsibility returned to its rightful place without argument. She believed relocation would freeze the past. Instead, it clarified it. Distance preserved her decision, but it stripped away her ability to shape its meaning. What remained was structure replacing story, and structure does not negotiate with sentiment once reality asserted itself fully without room left. She lost narrative control first, and that loss echoed louder than distance. Friends, institutions, and professionals no longer heard a confident explanation. They saw revisions, hesitations, and softened claims. Maturity is often mistaken for endless forgiveness, but maturity knows limits. It recognizes when silence is no longer kindness, but self-erasure. I did not need to correct stories. Systems corrected them naturally. Every revised agreement reflected reality rather than intention. She moved quickly to feel free, but speed exposed what patience would have concealed. That imbalance followed her into every conversation afterward without mercy or apology from anyone involved anywhere. Responsibilities shifted quietly, not as punishment, but as correction. Obligations were redistributed based on capacity, not convenience. Boundaries once negotiated emotionally became fixed through procedure. She realized too late that control depends on timing as much as choice. Some actions cannot be undone, only balanced until fairness returns. I did not celebrate that shift. I respected it. Rebalancing restores order without humiliating anyone. The loss was not material or geographic. It was the loss of influence over how events would be remembered. That absence lingered long after paperwork closed and conversations ended without resolution or the comfort she expected elsewhere. By moving too fast, she lost the ability to shape outcomes slowly. Distance offered relief, but not authority. Maturity does not cling or retaliate. It releases what no longer requires permission. I did not take anything from her. I simply stopped protecting illusions she depended on. Balance returned because imbalance was acknowledged. That is how closure works for adults. Not through erasing the past, but through placing it where it belongs, without apology, explanation, or continued negotiation. Some doors close quietly and never reopen again, leaving lessons intact and dignity preserved for those willing to accept reality as it stands. I never sent another message after that night because nothing remained unresolved. The email had done its work quietly, without follow-up or explanation. It aligned facts, timelines, and responsibility in a way no argument could undo. I did not feel victorious when I closed my inbox. I felt finished. Adults recognize when clarity replaces noise. She waited for reaction, escalation, or persuasion. None came. Silence after structure is final. Once truth is delivered correctly, repetition weakens it. The absence of further contact was not avoidance. It was confirmation that the matter had moved beyond conversation permanently, deliberately, without return. She believed moving states would end the discussion before it fully formed. Distance felt like protection, but distance only delays reckoning. The email removed uncertainty and replaced it with reference points that did not move. Jurisdiction, obligation, and memory do not disappear with geography. I did not chase her explanation or demand acknowledgement. The documentation spoke continuously on my behalf. Professionals understood it immediately. Friends noticed the change without instruction. Her story no longer traveled faster than the record. That shift altered everything without confrontation or spectacle. It reset power permanently for everyone involved across systems, conversations, and future decisions. I understood then why restraint matters later in life. Younger instincts seek closure through emotion. Mature instincts seek closure through alignment. I did not need to be understood to move forward. I needed accuracy to stand on its own. The email marked the boundary between reaction and consequence. From that moment, responses slowed, tones shifted, and assumptions collapsed naturally. Accountability replaced speculation. She learned movement does not erase responsibility. It sharpens it. When systems engage, intent becomes irrelevant. Only actions remain, preserved and measured without mercy or memory distortion. This lesson stayed with both of us permanently from point onward. I never followed up because alignment does not negotiate. The process moved forward without my presence, which is how real power behaves. She relocated her body, but accountability remained exactly where it belonged. That truth does not chase people. It waits. For adults, this is the quiet ending that matters most. No shouting, no victory speech, just outcomes settling into place. Real power is documented, timed, and impossible to ignore. When it arrives, explanations become unnecessary, and silence finally feels earned rather than empty. It marks maturity, closure, and self-respect earned through patience alone without conflict, noise, or regret.